So Edle, we speak a lot about AI readiness, but what does it now take to be ready for AI?
It's a good question. And for me, it's first of all important to acknowledge that AI doesn't have a single definition. There's not one AI technique. It's a range of techniques, going from the original old-fashioned rule-based into more classical AI, into Gen AI, into agentic AI, which is an expanding range of techniques. As one of our authors in the journal calls it, the arc of autonomy. And each one of those variants has its use still today. I wouldn't recommend a bank or an insurance company to go for every situation all the way to agentic, but to really look at what variant do I take for which situation.
Okay, and I believe it's important that we take distinction of that variation in AI, because obviously it will also have an impact in the way that data is being managed and that data is being governed. It's also so that data management, data governance, it's not new. It's something that organizations have been doing for the last 15 to 20 years, right? Investing in data platforms, compliance and programs, data governance to the full extent, and to be able to kind of like benefit with analytics and with reporting on top of that. But governance was seen back then much more as a controlling function and how to make sure that we're compliant with regulations. Whereas it's important to realize indeed with those different types of AI will bring different expectations on the data side.
Exactly, and the evolving variants will have increasing but also different requirements on your data environment, absolutely.
Edle, we speak a lot about AI, right, and how to move AI into measurable value, but what is actually needed from a data readiness angle?
It's a very good question, and I think for me it's important to acknowledge that there's no single technique to do AI. AI is really a range of technologies that is still growing and that is growing in maturity, going from still naming it the very old-fashioned rule-based into the classical discriminative AI to Gen AI to agents and agentic AI. What one of our authors in the journal calls the arc of autonomy, which I think is an interesting way of putting it. There is that whole range and it's going to keep growing. And it's important to stress that from a business perspective, it's not always necessary to go to that top autonomy level. Every type of AI has its benefits, and depending on the problem you're trying to solve, you really want to look at what kind of AI technique am I going to take.
It's important that we make that distinction, because the type of AI technique that we apply is obviously also going to have its effect on the data and on the data requirement.
Exactly.
Which I believe is something really new compared to how data was managed and governed in the past. I think in the past, governance was much more looked at, or data was at least much more looked at from a control function and making sure that we had the house in order from a data management angle for compliance programs, policies, and so on. But the notion of looking at data fueling AI and the different applications actually means that we there need to much more look at data as an enabler and really ask the questions, what does it take from a governance angle and a data requirements angle to successfully embed those different types of AI?
Agree. And so being ready from a data perspective is going to be an expanding list of requirements. Shall we maybe have a look at the different stages on that autonomy arc and have a look together at where they have value and what it means for data readiness?
Yeah, absolutely. Very good.
I wouldn't mind starting with the very old school rule-based version. It's not AI, but it still does give you a basis for value and for governance. And as a reminder, rule-based, a lot of the IT systems of a bank insurance will continue to use that. People define upfront the different scenarios that might be encountered, define the rules, tell the system how it should act, and it's completely deterministic in how it operates. In terms of operational processes, very strong. large volume, predictable situations, you can automate that way without any risk of inaccuracies or hallucinations. Think about payment processing, credit handling, any kind of backend in a bank or an insurance company. There's always going to be a big chunk of that. It's good basis for the data requirements as well, I would say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I believe it's also in that context of advanced analytics that the original business intelligence started to build up, because their institutions, they were collecting data in structured databases on top of which they try to derive value, and typically they were doing that by implementing business intelligence applications on top of that. And I think the main key element for that was to ensure that data was structured, was well organized with the right granularity level in those databases, that access was also guaranteed for the people to be able to actively use that data. But that in a way, compared to where we are now and how those data requirements are evolving, was kind of like the basis and the starting point.
Yeah, agree. If we look at the second one, classic AI, discriminative AI, forecasting AI, it's sort of not a very good label for it. But what it is you take very strong machine learning based statistical algorithms, which are empty, and which you train on your own set of historical data. Mass sets of data trained for a specific purpose. For me, still a very useful way of AI, because once you've trained it, it's not going to be 100% accurate because it's not rule-based, it's derived from data. You do have the issue of potential data bias in your training data, but once you have the system, you've tested it, it becomes predictable. Whatever you put in there as input, same model is going to give you the same output. It doesn't have the hallucination that we'll see with the later versions. If you talk about scanning of payment transactions for fraud or AML, credit scoring, things where you really want to have the benefit of machine learning but avoid the hallucination, it's still something to look at in detail. So I'm expecting that's going to stick around for a while. So data needs to be ready for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also something that you see on the data piece, right? The first step up from when we were talking about advanced analytics to the traditional ML learning, which is really all about building a model, being able to train a model so that actually you get to the most promising and correct results. And this is where the first shift started to happen, because it actually means that you need to be able to train the model on large volumes of data, data that typically didn't sit in test environment or in development environments. And if you really want to make sure that you have a model that is as accurate as possible, you need to have the best quality data, which is actually your production data that needs to be transferred into your other environments, which obviously then comes down to ensuring that you have the right controls in place from a security, from a privacy, from an accessibility angle. So that is definitely an additional level of complexity that you bring into the equation.
Yeah. And then we go to generative AI as the next level, not just being able to digest data, but also generate it. In its basic forms, business use is there. Chatbots, client interaction or employee interaction, anything around language, because obviously those models are pre-trained, they know a lot about domains, but they also have that language knowledge. So summarization, generation, in any kind of form within the organization is the next use.
Yeah.
What do we think about the requirements?
Well, and for me, this is where, again, you start to make a very big shift, because with the whole introduction of LLMs and what generative AI can bring, you also start to introduce additional sources of data. And you start to move more and more away from structured to unstructured data. That is definitely a key element. You also start to incorporate other sources. So you move away from your proprietary sources and you start to collect data from from the public domain. So that obviously brings in the additional challenge, how to make sure that the data that you bring in is of the right quality and that you can actually unify it with the data on which you reside. Obviously also the opportunity to deploy a chatbot on top of your company SharePoint, for instance, as well, basically makes that you're bringing in a new sets of data where you also need to make sure, again, in terms of that accessibility, personal data that should be protected, that you make sure that that is kind of like all well considered. And then I think on the other side, so this is actually all of the data that feeds into the LLM models, but on the other side, we also start to think about, okay, how do we become more effective in terms of prompting within the organization? And so what do you do with the output of those prompts?
Yeah.
And what do you do with prompt instructions themselves? Because this is obviously a way for you to increase the literacy within your own institution. So, but for that, you also need to make the right decisions to store and make that information somewhere accessible in the right location.
Yeah. And then where Gen AI was still, you said it, prompting, questioning, a bit slower in pace, stepping that up in agentic AI, whether it's individual agents on smaller processes or full-fledged orchestration across multiple agents. That's where you really go into online execution of processes. Reconciliation, trade, payments could be one. Investigation handling could be one. There's plenty of examples where that whole, not just consulting data, not just generating, but updating data instantaneously in the different systems is getting very frequently used, let's say, is another step up in what you're going to ask from your data environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I believe one important element with that is the notion of orchestration, because you will obviously have a number of agents that will start to work autonomously and basically make the process more efficient and faster. But with that, obviously, then also comes the challenge to how do you make sure that the output of what the agents are doing is still stored, is reviewed, and that we apply the right controls on top of it, because the more that we go to autonomous kind of like embedding of AI in business use cases, the more that we need to make sure that the new output which is being generated has strong human in the loop kind of like controls.
Capabilities, yeah.
So Edle, we speak a lot about AI, but what does it now take in terms of data readiness to really get the full benefit from AI?
It's a good question. And for me, it's important to first of all acknowledge that there's no single AI technique. AI is not one single thing. It's a range of techniques and a range that is still evolving, that is increasing in maturity. And as one of our authors in the journal calls it, the arc of autonomy, so increasing in autonomy. And that puts different requirements on your data environment. Now, from a business perspective, especially in financial services, as a heavily regulated industry, an industry around people's money, so high trust, high expectations, it is important to define where you want to go on that arc for every challenge you have in front of you. If you look at transaction scanning for fraud, for AML, credit scoring, the calculation models, you really want to consider sitting on the classical AI instead of going agentic. If you think about client advisory interaction on your financial products, you can easily go into Gen AI and agentic AI because the situation is different. So for me, important to not see the end point as what you want to aim at for every case, but consider that you're going to be spanning that whole arc and taking that into account when you talk about data layer and data layer AI readiness and what requirements you have in there.
Okay, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that differentiation of AI and how to use it within your financial services organization will obviously also have an impact in the way that you look at your data readiness, right? And also there it's going to be a build-up in terms of like really understanding what is the requirements that come on top when you go from advanced analytics through to traditional ML to Gen AI or agentic AI, which I believe is slightly different to compare to what financial institutions have been doing so far. Because in the past, organizations have been investing quite a bit in terms of data platforms, data management, compliance program, governance policies, all with the purpose to make sure that they were compliant as an organization. But what I do sense and hear is that it's much more becoming, governance is much more becoming an enabling function. But there again, to your point, it's not about shifting from left to right in one go, but it's really kind of like looking at what is the steps that we need to take for a specific application of AI for a given business context in which we're operating. That's
exactly, and keeping in mind that it's going to continue to grow, so the flexibility in your governance to keep accommodating new requirements is going to be an important one. So now that we've looked at all the different stages, if we bring it back to the whole arc, key conclusion for me is that it will be important for financial institutions to get a good understanding of where they are today, how they want to use AI, and then work to understand the roadmap they'll have to go through for getting ready from a data perspective.
Yeah, you're right. Where organizations today they had a certain maturity state. I think AI is simply forcing them to kind of like uplift and to really look at what are now the steps to take to make sure that AI can be used effectively so that it starts to deliver value once it's put in production.
Yeah, interesting challenge ahead.
All right, yes. Yeah.